Zelensky, as I said, skeptical about his relationship still with President Putin, but I think they welcome, of course, these additional weapons. And that 50-day deadline has got a lot of people talking here in Ukraine, whether it's just too long, 50 days.
And okay, I think that's good. Yeah, the rest of them are muted. Zoomers, I'm just letting you know, be patient. We haven't started yet. Waiting for our speaker. So we'll start momentarily.
That's right. Yeah. Yeah, sure. It's still good.
You about ready? About ready, Richard?
Yeah.
Okay. I guess we'll go ahead and get started. Um, Zoomers, you're muted, stay muted. You can ask your questions at the end. You put them in the chat. If you've got a cell phone, if you please turn it down or turn it off, it would be greatly appreciated. Um, this is Richard McMaster, and he's going to talk about a world of goods today. Take it away, Richard.
Excuse me. Let me catch my breath here. All right. Yeah.
Yeah, it's just on. You have to hold a little close.
Right. Okay. Very good. About 2005, about 2005, uh, a professor at Northwestern University named Timothy Breen published a book, and the starting point of his book was, how did you bring such a disparate group of people as lived in the American colonies into a sense of unity, that they had a common cause, and when many of them could not speak each other's language, they had great disparities of wealth and poverty, and yet they seem to emerge as Americans. And his conclusion was, interestingly, that uh, it was because they were all consumers. They were united by the fact that they bought and owned all kinds of stuff. So very much like us, that we are united because we go to Talbot's or we go to Sam's Club or whatever nonsense that creates a community, because we don't have the strength of the old community. So that's overshadowing this. I'm not I'm not making his case, but I just suggest that's where we start, and why this is going to be really an important segment of the development toward independence. So let's get the next one. Now I'm ready to roll. Yes, okay. I'll just read the first bit there. From the last decade of the 17th century into the 18th century, living standards rose steadily in both Britain and in the American colonies. This meant that more people could now buy what had been luxury goods. So in the early 17th century, for example, if you smoked tobacco, you practically were a member of the royal court. You had to be a very wealthy person indeed. If you used sugar freely, or you had tea, well, you were somebody who really didn't have to look at the price tag. Whereas by the 18th century, it's commonplace that workmen will have a pipe of tobacco and come home and have a cup of tea and coffee. And so sugar, tobacco, rice, coffee, China tea, Indian textiles, Madeira and otherwise became commonplace. And this is a marked change. And what effect does it have? Well, just think about the different items that are listed there. Sugar was initially based in Brazil, moved into the West Indies. The West Indian colonies of the British and of the other European powers almost all became sugar islands. And suddenly, because it was within the reach of ordinary people, the production of sugar rises incrementally almost. And the same with tobacco. If tobacco was something that only the very few could have, then it wasn't going to be a profitable industry in the Chesapeake, in Maryland and Virginia. Coffee, tea and Indian textiles meant that the East India Company was now carrying tremendous amounts of goods into Britain, some of them then going off to the American colonies, but most being absorbed in Britain, and Madeira and other wines and so on. So it's a rising standard. And let's get the next one. Well, I was going to say, all of this meant that now you needed certain kinds of things. Every family now had a teapot, teacups, spoons, earthenware dishes, and other luxuries. And these were things that had to be manufactured. Somebody has to make the teapot. Somebody had to make the earthenware dishes, and of course, porcelain and better things were being imported from the East India Company. And how do we know this? It, I'm I'm going to spin along. I'm not going to just read these things all afternoon. Uh, that would be boring, wouldn't it? Uh, but what I wanted to say is a lot of what we know about what people have is because it, certainly through the 18th century, well, the 17th and 18th century, in the American colonies, it was customary to have a very detailed inventory taken of your property after you died. And consequently, one is surprised to discover that, let's take a prosperous farmer in Connecticut or Long Island, someone you would think, well, he's doing quite well, that his house had a table. He may have had one or two chairs. People sat on what were really boxes. They ate off of wooden dishes. They rarely had a lot of cutlerware. They may have had iron pots to cook in and so on, but not many of them. Beds, very limited. Bedding, very limited. And clothing. You know, if your good wife had two dresses, that might have been quite enough. And by the 18th century, as we move along, I mean, it gets better and better. It's a commonplace now that people have a great change of wardrobe. People have all kinds of furniture in their houses. They don't have to sit on a box when they're eating their dinner. They have often really elaborate imported furniture, and they're still just really prosperous farmers in Connecticut or Long Island. So the I can't even read what I'm saying. The tremendously expanding markets then, as I think I said this already, uh, made plantations in the staple agriculture colonies very profitable. And since all of them were also agriculture that depended heavily on unfree labor, we have a tremendous expansion of the slave trade. Toward, toward the end of the 17th century, the British Royal Africa Company was, which had a monopoly of the slave trade, was able to produce a certain number of slaves, most of whom were taken to the West Indies, very few to North America. By 1713, when their monopoly was abolished and any merchant could now engage in slave trade, it began an enormous expansion of the British slave trade. And thanks to the agreement in the Treaty of Utrecht in that same year, 1713, the British had a monopoly on delivering slaves to Spanish colonies. So merchants in the slave trade were also prospering tremendously. And as consumers grew more able to purchase things, so too we begin to move into what is called the consumer revolution. That's a term that was coined by a British historian named Neil McKendrick in about 1980. And it refers to the fact that people no longer wanted to be satisfied with just any old goods. If you get the shipping manifesto of a ship that was trading in the American colonies in the 17th century, they're often, it's just a hodgepodge of odds and ends they'd picked up here, there, and everywhere. And, well, you didn't have much of a choice. So if you wanted a pot, you got that pot, and so on. But this changes. So let's go down to the next one. All right. Now we're moving into something that probably you remember from school, that the British policy, as we were taught, and that's a good many years ago, as we were taught, was mercantilism. And mercantilism, as I understood it as a young student, was it meant that it was advantageous to have everything that you used or bought or sold produced within a closed setup of your own country. And so I'm borrowing these four lines, 5 lines, I guess, from Charles MacLean Andrews, who was probably the best known colonial historian in the 1940s. And he says, what was British policy enunciated in the late 1660s with the passage of the first Navigation Acts? Well, it was the colonies would have a monopoly of the home market, that Britons would not be importing sugar from Brazil if they could get it from Barbados. England has a monopoly of the colonial output. So if the people in Virginia were raising tobacco, it went to Britain. It did not go to Holland or to France or Spain. England was to control the carrying trade. They were concerned in the 1660s very much with the Dutch. The Dutch had lots of advantages and a vast merchant marine, so they wanted to get them out of the way. Then colonial produce will be charged duties on arrival, and we'll see how that's going to work. And the Royal Navy and Merchant Marine are absolutely essential to the survival of our nation. Therefore, we have to keep lots of ships and consequently lots of trained seamen available. So if the Royal Navy needs to press more men, they can find men who know what they're doing. So let's try the next one now. All right. Now, this is the last one, actually. I'm, I'm going to talk now about the whole impact of the Navigation Act. By the time I was in college, in the 50s and then on to graduate school. I think we turned around. It was thought in the 40s and a long time before that that the navigation acts were one of the real driving forces that people wanted to get away from British rule. And by the 50s, historians had turned around and they were saying, no, there were real advantages to that system. It gave you a secure market if you were a planter in Maryland. It gave you a secure market if you were a merchant in London. And it had all kinds of advantages like that. Well, why is that? Well, it was because it was really a very complex web of special interests. It was not some simple black and white, keep the Dutch out, keep the English in. It was rather because the Parliament itself represented very special interests, mainly large landowners, that all of the laws regarding imports, exports, taxes, tariffs were all based on special interests. Let me just rattle a few of them off. The Irish, Ireland being not part of the United Kingdom, but a separate part of British rule, was forbidden to ship woolen goods of any kind to England. They could not send them to the American colonies either, or any of the colonies. So if they were going to have sheep sheared and turned into wool, it was going to have to be for totally Irish consumption. Well, another one was that Ireland could not send live cattle to England. Live cattle would be destined for the meat market. And so if they were going to keep beef cattle, it had to be either for local consumption or in this case, it could be barreled up and sent to the colonies. Now, why was that? Not to impoverish the great landowners in Ireland. That certainly wasn't their intention. But it was to protect the woolen industry that was focused or centered mainly in southwest England, in Devonshire and the rest of the West Country, and also in parts of Yorkshire. They did not want meat cattle competing with British cattle raisers. So if you were going to buy roast beef or beef for making roast beef, it was going to be English beef. It wasn't going to be Irish beef. But what about the people with special interests in Ireland? Well, almost simultaneously, are you getting a feedback or something? Can you hear me all right? Yeah, good, good, good. Almost simultaneously, Parliament encouraged the linen industry and had I can't think of the word, you are paid if you landed Irish linen in Liverpool, and you were then paid a bounty. That's the word I was thinking of. Irish linen was given a bounty on top of whatever price you might get for it. So they were fostering it that way. And in 1735, because the linen industry required imported flaxseed, you couldn't just take the existing flax plants and grow them for seed and also for the staple uh, fibers. So they put a bounty on flaxseed from America. So farmers from Connecticut to Maryland benefited by raising flaxseed and sending it to Ireland. So, and similarly with with the uh, with the cattle, they didn't expect you not to raise cattle. They wanted you to raise dairy cattle. So just as you can find all over grocery stores today Irish butter, linen and butter became the major exports from Ireland all through the 18th and 19th centuries. And similarly, with the situation in the American colonies, the tobacco that was shipped from Virginia to any one of a number of English ports would pay a duty. There was a tariff on it. But if you then turned around and transshipped it and sent it to Scotland or Ireland or Holland or France, that tariff was given back to you. So you had a benefit in that. And similarly with other kinds of uh, of colonial products. Now, the beginnings of all of this was a pretty evolving regulation of trade. And it was generally accepted, at least officially on both sides of the Atlantic, but regularly evaded. The customs officers were very poorly paid, and consequently, it was to their advantage to take a little something under the table and say, instead of bringing in this, you know, 300 hogsheads of tobacco, you only brought in 100 and you paid on that. And smuggling was almost a given. One of the very early 18th century customs officers on Long Island was forced to say, I really can't continue to accept this appointment because all of my relatives are smugglers and they insist they will knock me on the head if I don't resign. So, but it was widely accepted. So quite significant merchants would, well, there's a tobacco merchant in Whitehaven who says in the 1730s that, you know, I have an arrangement with the customs in Kirkcudbright, very close to Whitehaven, but in Scotland. And so I land my tobacco there, and then they send it back to me, and I don't pay anything because, you know, they're my friends and I pay them off. And so it's a very common thing in this way. Now, it is increasingly not seen as a form of taxation, although of course it is. It's uh, it's strange that in the 19th century in America, uh, a significant part of the population believed you could have a tariff for revenue, but not to regulate trade. Whereas in the 18th century, it was pretty well accepted that you could have a tariff to regulate trade, but not really just to raise a revenue, although the two are interchangeable. So it's at this point I want to get into the whole idea of this consumer revolution. And I have to check a couple of figures here. I brought a paper in with me that I had because I never could remember numbers. But it's significant that, first of all, what McKendrick and others wrote about as a consumer revolution was the fact that people became increasingly demanding, that they didn't want just any old piece of woolen cloth or any old cambric, whatever color. They wanted fashionable colors. They wanted a weave that was very attractive. They didn't want any old kind of earthenware dishes. They wanted queensware. They wanted other patterns. They wanted Chinese porcelain and so on. And so you have a very demanding, uh, there's an exchange of letters that I read a number of years ago from the agent of a Yorkshire woolen manufacturer. And by the way, when we talk about manufacturers, this is all pieced out to people at home that we don't have until 1779 when Arkwright actually built one. We don't have anything like a textile factory in England. That's all a phenomenon of the later 18th century. So we have demands from the consumers, but also an amazing development. By 1750, the American colonies bought 2% of British exports. And the amount, I'd have to put, I should have done this in a different way, but I'm stuck now. I, I have the actual figures as to how much this was, and it wasn't very much. In money of 1750, it was in the range of 2,200 pounds. So almost all of British exports went somewhere else. By 1765, 15 years later, the American colonies accounted for 23% of all British exports. And the total value in the money of that time was 4,600,000 pounds. So you went from 2,000 to 4 million. So what was this doing? Well, it's forming a mindset as we move into the later part of the 18th century. On the American side, because in a sense you are what you own, if now you have all these nice things, you are not sitting on a box and only grandma gets to sit in a chair. You know, you have lovely furniture. You've got even Chippendale piece in the front room, and so on. And so it gives you the impression among Americans that we are now actually quite prosperous. We are certainly living a lot better than Dad and Mother did when I was a kid. So yeah, we've come into the world, and so they feel a certain strength in their own society. On the British side, that same thing gives you the impression that, well, the Americans are so wealthy now, they can demand that they get this exact shade of damask to make a dress. They're not just taking any old leftovers, that they're wealthy enough to pay their share. Didn't the British taxpayer support them in the war with the French? Who got rid of the French and Indians but the British taxpayer? So they should be paying their share. And then the second part of that is that if you're only exporting 2% of your net exports, you could well afford to lose the trade of New York or Boston. You know, what if we no longer had a good market in Charleston, South Carolina? Well, it doesn't amount to very much. If, on the other hand, a quarter of all the exports, all the things made and shipped, transshipped from Britain, are all going to the American colonies, you know, maybe we don't want to lose that market. That would be very dangerous. So you begin to get a mindset that we should regulate more than we're regulating now, keep a closer control. So this slides into the last part of this. The importance of the American market was demonstrated in the Stamp Act crisis of 1765, 1766. The, excuse me, the Stamp Act was actually passed in 1764. It was to go into effect in 1765. It required that you bought for all kinds of documents, from legal documents to newspapers, and bills of lading for ships, all kinds of things, almost anything you could think of, a stamp that was valued at 1 penny or 2 pennies, and you had to affix that onto the document or the newspaper or the bill or whatever to make it legal. Now, that was unpopular in England. The British public and the British mercantile community didn't leap up and say, oh, we've been just waiting for this, how wonderful. But so there was an opposition in England already. The Americans felt this is not just regulation. This is taxation, direct taxation, and as we'll come back to this whole issue again, but it's direct taxation, not by our own legislature, and not even by a parliament with American members of parliament sitting there to vote on it. So we don't want this. So we would like to say we will embargo British goods of all kinds, East India goods, anything coming from Britain. And in order to do that, the American merchants had to turn to what were called in Britain the America merchants, that is, merchants trading to the American colonies. And they agreed that they would not send out any orders in the spring of 1765. So no British goods would be ordered by them to go to their correspondents in the American colonies. They wanted to do that to put pressure on the manufacturers, who are really a kind of middleman who passed out orders and bought the finished products of people who made cloth or nails or all sorts of metallic things and so on in their homes, and then brought them to market. The linen, for example, was all made by people, farmers, in their own homes, and then brought to the linen hall to be purchased by a middleman who in that case was a bleacher, and he would bleach the brown linen, and then he would parcel it up and send it to either himself or another merchant to be shipped to wherever. So the manufacturers are then to also press Parliament for a repeal of this act, and they generally agree. Now we come to the people who actually made the cloth, and they had no say in it whatsoever. If the local farmer in Devonshire was working on making a broadcloth, woolen broadcloth, he no longer had a market. He could not be employed. Well, how did he survive? Well, maybe he didn't. And so there's a, to me, a very interesting intersection at this point in the Stamp Act crisis. And that is that there was a widespread failure of the wheat crop across Britain, Ireland, and much of the continent of Europe, and especially Southern Europe. Now, in normal times, it was forbidden to import grain of any kind, actually, but primarily wheat, into the British Isles. There was a bounty on exporting it from the British Isles to other countries in the Mediterranean, because that would be profitable and would keep up the price level of wheat, which meant that since most English farmers, and Scottish and Irish also, were in fact tenants, that they could afford to pay their rent. The landowner, who had huge swaths of land, wouldn't have to say, oh, I have to reduce my rent, or these people can't pay it. Rather, they can pay it. Prices are good. But in the time of crisis, when there is no crop coming in at home, then they would allow the importation of wheat. And in most cases, it came from, and certainly in the 1760s, that coming into England came mainly from the Baltic and from North Germany. But the American colonies shipped quite a lot also. This took a while to remedy the situation. So in the meantime, you had in all the manufacturing districts, you had prices for wheat when it was ever available going out, out of sight. So people, even if they could find it, they couldn't afford it. Poor people couldn't afford, working people couldn't afford it. So increasingly in that winter in 1765, you have people who are very hungry, and you begin to have food riots. People storm a mill, or they board a ship that is said to have a cargo of wheat on it, and they have to call out troops to quell this. It's not just in the cloth making industry areas, the nail making areas also. The nails were frequently made just by a group of people in a rural area, but they didn't have land to farm. They were totally dependent. They were workmen. They and their families depended on buying food, and if there was no food to buy, they were going to be starving. So you had riots, all right? And this, I believe, is a major factor in the repeal of the Stamp Act, that the Parliament realized we just can't go on like this. We have to allow the trade to open again. We can't allow the economy to be lost. The grain famine also had a salutary effect in America. The merchants who had said, oh, we won't order anything from England, well, that meant we won't have anything much to sell. So how are we going to survive? And a merchant in Baltimore wrote that if it had not been for the demand for grain in the Mediterranean, we would all have been bankrupt. So the grain famine, I think, is a very significant part of that. But that's not the lesson that people took then. And so what they said was, look, in America, we are so strong, and the British are so dependent on us, that if ever they try this taxation without representation again, all we have to do is say, sorry, no importation, and they'll come around. And that never proved true. And On the British side, of course, it was that this is a fluke. People in Parliament, a whole lot of speeches in Parliament on opposition to repeal is, you know, if they get away with this, they'll want to get away with any kind of law. So we can't let this ever happen again. So there we are, and we're sliding into the next stage of the road to independence. So I hope I was coherent. I hope I didn't put too many people to sleep. But if you'd like to have any questions or your comments or challenges, pass this over to Pam.
Any questions for him? Anybody? No? I think they got it understood then. There's no questions. Oh, thank you. Thank you. I didn't see that. Thank you.
Do you remember who was the prime minister in Britain at the time this was going on?
In the 1760s, offhand, no. I can't think. It might have been Pitt the Elder still. It might have been William Pitt the Elder,
Oh, boy.
but because he had fought the French Indian War, the 7 Years' War. See, he may still have been in office. I honestly don't know. Grenville. Yes.
Bill.
Yes. Good. I think we learned something.
Any other questions?
I'm going to make one comment that
I don't think so.
I am 90 years old, and to prove we're never too old to learn something, I was writing an article about the grain trade and the rise of Baltimore for Pennsylvania history. And it was while I was researching this about 18 months ago that I realized that grain and the grain famine in England was really inseparable from the whole Stamp Act crisis. I had never connected those. I never knew anything about it. And I thought, yeah, so who knows, you know? By next week, I might have learned something else. Who knows? Well, anyway, thanks very much.
Thank you for coming. Take care.